In the middle of a war-torn battlefield, when bullets flew like deadly rain and explosions shook the earth beneath her feet, Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez made a choice that would define not just her military career, but her entire life. While her commanding officer lay bleeding and unconscious in the mud, enemy forces closing in from all sides, she had two options: follow protocol and call for backup that might never come, or break every rule in the book to save both her commander and complete a mission that could save hundreds of lives. What happened next in those crucial 47 minutes would later be studied in military academies around the world, not just for its tactical brilliance, but for the raw human courage it displayed. This is the true story of how one soldier's split-second decision turned a potential disaster into one of the most remarkable rescue and combat operations in modern military history. The enemy thought they had won when they saw the American commander fall. They were about to learn just how wrong they could be. The desert heat shimmered off the rocky terrain as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her helmet and checked her rifle for the third time in 10 minutes. The forward operating base buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that always preceded a high-stakes mission. Around her, fellow soldiers made final preparations, their movements precise and practiced despite the tension that hung in the air like morning fog. Captain James Mitchell, her commanding officer, stood near the mission briefing board, his weathered face serious, as he studied satellite images of their target location. At 42, Mitchell had served 3 tours of duty and earned the respect of every soldier under his command. His calm demeanor and tactical expertise had gotten them through numerous dangerous operations, but today felt different. Even Rodriguez, with her 5 years of combat experience, could sense the weight of what lay ahead. The intelligence reports painted a grim picture. A group of insurgents had taken control of a strategic communications outpost 15 kilometers north of their position. The facility housed crucial equipment that, in the wrong hands, could compromise Allied operations across the entire region. More importantly, 3 American contractors were being held hostage inside the compound. The mission was clear: neutralize the threat, secure the facility, and extract the hostages alive. Rodriguez had been specifically chosen for this operation because of her exceptional marksmanship skills and her ability to think quickly under pressure. Her fellow soldiers often joked that she had ice water in her veins, but Rodriguez knew the truth was more complicated. Every successful mission came from careful preparation, split-second decision-making, and a healthy dose of controlled fear that kept her sharp and focused. The team assembled for the final briefing consisted of 8 highly trained soldiers, each with specialized skills that would be crucial for the mission's success. Besides Rodriguez and Captain Mitchell, there was Sergeant First Class David Chen, their explosives expert, Corporal Lisa Thompson, their communications specialist, Private First Class Marcus Johnson, their medic, Specialist Sarah Williams, their intelligence analyst, Corporal Robert Martinez, their heavy weapons operator, and Private Jake Anderson, their youngest member but an exceptional scout. Captain Mitchell began the briefing by pointing to aerial photographs spread across the table. The target compound was built into a hillside, surrounded by natural rocky formations that provided both defensive advantages and potential cover for an attacking force. The main building was 2 stories tall, with thick concrete walls and small windows that would make any assault challenging. Intelligence suggested approximately 12 to 15 insurgents were holed up inside, armed with automatic weapons and possibly explosive devices. The plan was methodical and precise. They would approach the compound under cover of darkness, using the rocky terrain to mask their movement. Rodriguez and Williams would take position on a ridge overlooking the facility, providing overwatch and covering fire for the assault team. Chen would disable any perimeter security systems, while Thompson established communication links with headquarters. Martinez would provide heavy suppressive fire if needed, while Johnson stood ready to treat any wounded team members or hostages. Captain Mitchell emphasized the importance of speed and coordination. Intelligence indicated that the insurgents were planning to move the hostages to a secondary location within 48 hours. This mission represented their only realistic chance of rescue before the situation became exponentially more complicated. The stakes couldn't be higher, and everyone understood that failure wasn't an option. As the team made final equipment checks, Rodriguez found herself thinking about the letter she'd written to her younger sister back home in Texas. It was a tradition she'd developed before every dangerous mission. A way of putting her thoughts and feelings into words just in case something went wrong. She never sent the letters, but writing them helped her focus on what really mattered and why she'd chosen to serve her country. The convoy departed the base just after midnight, their vehicles moving without lights through the desert landscape. The night vision equipment cast everything in an eerie green glow, transforming familiar terrain into an alien world of shadows and shapes. Rodriguez felt the familiar pre-mission butterflies in her stomach a sensation she'd learned to channel into heightened awareness and readiness. The journey to the target area took nearly 2 hours, with the vehicles taking a circuitous route to avoid known insurgent patrol areas. As they neared the compound, the team dismounted and began the careful process of moving into position on foot. The rocky terrain provided excellent cover, and it also made movement slow and challenging. Every step had to be deliberate and silent. Rodriguez and Williams made their way to the overwatch position, a rocky outcropping that provided clear sight lines to the target compound. Through her rifle scope, Rodriguez could see lights in several windows of the main building and what appeared to be sentries walking patrol routes around the perimeter. The intelligence reports seemed accurate, which was both reassuring and concerning, given how heavily defended the position appeared to be. Captain Mitchell's voice crackled through their radio headsets as he coordinated the team's movements. Chen had successfully disabled the perimeter alarm system, and Thompson had established secure communications with headquarters. Everything was proceeding according to plan, but Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go very wrong. The assault began at exactly 0347 hours. Martinez opened up with suppressive fire from his position, sending streams of tracers toward the compound's defensive positions. The insurgents responded immediately, their muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness as they returned fire. Captain Mitchell led the main assault team forward, using the covering fire to advance on the building's main entrance. Rodriguez tracked targets through her scope, taking careful shots at insurgent positions and providing covering fire for her advancing teammates. Her training and experience served her well as she methodically engaged threats, each shot placed with precision to maximize effectiveness while conserving ammunition. The sound of gunfire echoed off the rocky hillsides, creating a cacophony of noise that seemed to come from all directions. The initial assault went smoothly. Chen's explosive charges breached the main entrance, and the assault team moved into the building with practiced efficiency. Through her scope, Rodriguez could see her teammates clearing rooms and advancing toward the area where intelligence suggested the hostages were being held. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. Then disaster struck with shocking suddenness. An explosion erupted from somewhere inside the building, much larger than Chen's breaching charges. The blast was powerful enough to shake the ground beneath Rodriguez's position and send debris flying in all directions. Through her scope, she watched in horror as Captain Mitchell stumbled out of the building, his uniform torn and bloodied. Before she could react, insurgent fighters who had been concealed in positions around the compound opened fire with renewed intensity. Captain Mitchell, already wounded from the explosion, was caught in the open with limited cover. Rodriguez watched helplessly as her commanding officer was hit multiple times and collapsed in the courtyard between the building and the defensive positions her team had established. The situation had gone from controlled assault to desperate rescue mission in a matter of seconds. The carefully planned operation was falling apart, and Captain Mitchell lay motionless in the kill zone between opposing forces. Rodriguez knew that, without immediate action, they would lose both their commanding officer and any chance of completing the mission successfully. Through her radio headset, she could hear the chaos as team members tried to coordinate a response to the unexpected turn of events. Chen was calling for covering fire to attempt a rescue of the captain. Thompson was trying to reach headquarters for immediate backup support. Martinez was laying down suppressive fire, but the insurgents had superior defensive positions and were making any movement toward the captain extremely dangerous. Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. Without waiting for orders or coordinating with the rest of the team, she slung her rifle across her back and began moving down from her overwatch position toward the compound. Williams called out over the radio, asking what she was doing, but Rodriguez was already committed to her course of action. The rocky terrain that had provided excellent cover during their approach now seemed like an obstacle course as Rodriguez scrambled down the hillside toward the firefight below. Bullets whined past her position as insurgent fighters spotted her movement, but she used every piece of natural cover available to shield her advance. As she reached the edge of the compound's defensive perimeter, Rodriguez could see Captain Mitchell more clearly. He was alive but unconscious, blood seeping from multiple wounds. The distance between his position and safety was perhaps 50 meters, but those 50 meters were swept by crossfire from multiple insurgent positions. Anyone attempting a rescue would be exposed to deadly accurate fire from at least 3 different directions. Rodriguez checked her ammunition and equipment one final time. She had her sidearm, several grenades, a field medical kit, and the knowledge that her teammates were depending on her to do something that military doctrine would consider nearly impossible. The next few minutes would determine whether Captain Mitchell lived or died, and whether their mission had any chance of success. Taking a deep breath and saying a quick prayer, Rodriguez prepared to leave the relative safety of her cover and enter what would later be described as one of the most intense firefights of the entire conflict. She thought briefly of her sister back in Texas, of the letter she'd written but never sent, and of the oath she'd taken to leave no soldier behind. The insurgents continued their steady fire, believing they had the American forces pinned down and their commander neutralized. They had no way of knowing that Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was about to prove them catastrophically wrong. Rodriguez burst from cover like a sprinter leaving the starting blocks, her boots pounding against the rocky ground as bullets cracked through the air around her. The insurgents had been focused on the main assault team's positions, but her unexpected movement from the flank caught them off guard for the crucial first few seconds she needed. Those seconds were everything. Rodriguez zigzagged across the open ground, using a combination of natural terrain features and pure speed to make herself a difficult target. A concrete barrier that had once been part of the compound's original defenses provided her first piece of substantial cover, and she dove behind it just as a burst of automatic fire chewed chunks of concrete from its top edge. From her new position, Rodriguez could see Captain Mitchell more clearly. He was lying on his side, one arm bent at an unnatural angle, dark stains spreading across his desert camouflage uniform. His chest was rising and falling, which meant he was still breathing. But Rodriguez could tell from the amount of blood that time was running out. Every second she delayed meant less chance of getting him back alive. The insurgent positions were now focused on her location, which actually worked in her favor. By drawing their attention, she was giving her teammates better opportunities to engage from their established positions. She could hear Martinez's heavy machine gun chattering from somewhere behind her, and through her earpiece, she heard Chen coordinating the rest of the team for a coordinated push. Rodriguez pulled a smoke grenade from her belt and hurled it toward the area between her position and Captain Mitchell. The white smoke began to billow immediately, creating a screen that would provide some concealment for her next move. But smoke worked both ways, and she knew the insurgents would be expecting her to use it for cover. Instead, she did something unexpected. While the smoke was still building, Rodriguez sprinted not toward the smoke screen, but around it, approaching Captain Mitchell from an angle the insurgents wouldn't anticipate. The maneuver was risky because it kept her exposed longer, but it also meant she wouldn't be running blind into whatever weapons might be trained on the smoke cloud. Bullets snapped past her head and kicked up dust at her feet as she ran, but Rodriguez had entered what soldiers sometimes call the zone, a state of heightened focus where training and instinct take over completely. She could hear individual shots being fired, could almost sense the trajectories of incoming rounds, and her body seemed to move automatically to avoid the most dangerous lines of fire. She reached Captain Mitchell and immediately began assessing his condition while remaining as low as possible. He had taken at least 3 hits, one in the shoulder, one in the leg, and what appeared to be a grazing wound along his ribs. The shoulder wound was bleeding heavily, and Rodriguez could see that he was going into shock. His pulse was rapid and weak, his skin pale and clammy. Working quickly, Rodriguez applied pressure dressings to the worst wounds and injected the captain with morphine for pain management. The medical training all soldiers received had never felt more important than it did in those moments. With enemy fire continuing to snap overhead and the knowledge that every second of delay made their situation more desperate. The next challenge was getting Captain Mitchell to safety, and it was going to require all of Rodriguez's strength and determination. The captain was nearly twice her size, unconscious, and dead weight. The distance to the nearest substantial cover was about 30 meters, but it might as well have been 30 miles given the intensity of enemy fire. Rodriguez grabbed Captain Mitchell under his arms and began dragging him backward toward the defensive positions her team had established. The smoke from her grenade was beginning to dissipate, and she knew she had only moments before the insurgents would have clear shots at both of them. Her back and leg muscles screamed with the effort of moving the captain's weight, but adrenaline and determination kept her moving. Halfway to safety, disaster struck again. An insurgent with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher had positioned himself at an upper window of the main building, and Rodriguez saw him taking aim directly at her position. There was nowhere to run and no time to seek cover while dragging the wounded captain. The RPG streaked across the compound with a sound like tearing cloth. Rodriguez threw herself over Captain Mitchell, shielding him with her own body as the explosive round detonated against the concrete barrier she'd used for cover earlier. The blast wave knocked the wind out of her lungs and left her ears ringing, but the barrier had absorbed most of the shrapnel that would have torn them both apart. Before the insurgent could reload, Rodriguez heard the distinctive crack of a precision rifle shot from her team's overwatch position. Williams had taken out the RPG gunner with a single shot through the upper window. The covering fire from her teammates intensified, giving Rodriguez the breathing room she needed to continue dragging Captain Mitchell towards safety. The final 20 meters felt like a marathon. Rodriguez's strength was beginning to fade, her hands cramped from gripping the captain's equipment harness, and her lungs burned from the smoke and dust in the air. But she could see Chen and Johnson moving forward to help, their rifles laying down, covering fire as they bounded from one piece of cover to another. When she finally reached the safety of the team's defensive perimeter, Rodriguez collapsed beside Captain Mitchell, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. Johnson immediately took over medical care, starting an IV line and checking the captain's vital signs. His assessment was grim but hopeful. Captain Mitchell had lost a lot of blood and needed immediate evacuation, but he would survive if they could get him to a medical facility quickly. Chen grabbed Rodriguez by the shoulder and looked directly into her eyes. "That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the craziest," he said. "But you got him out. Now what's the plan for the mission?" That question hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. In her focus on rescuing Captain Mitchell, she had almost forgotten about the 3 American contractors still being held hostage inside the compound. The mission wasn't over. It had just become infinitely more complicated. With their commanding officer out of action, the team's leadership structure was in chaos, and the insurgents were now fully alert and prepared for whatever came next. Thompson crawled over to their position, her radio crackling with communications from headquarters. "Command wants to know our status and whether we need immediate extraction for the captain," she reported. "They're also asking about the hostage situation." Rodriguez looked at the building where muzzle flashes still flickered from various windows. The insurgents had used the confusion of the rescue to reinforce their positions and were now better prepared than ever to resist any assault. A traditional frontal attack would likely result in heavy casualties and might get the hostages killed before they could be rescued. But Rodriguez had an idea forming in her mind, a plan so audacious that it would require her to do something no military manual had ever contemplated. She looked at Captain Mitchell's M4 rifle, still slung across his shoulder, and then at the building where the hostages were being held. "Chen, how long do you think it would take to organize a full-scale assault with backup from the base?" she asked. Chen considered the question seriously. With the captain down and the compound fully alerted, at least 2 hours to get additional forces here and coordinate a proper attack. Maybe 3 hours if command decides to wait for air support. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Intelligence had indicated the insurgents were planning to move the hostages within hours. Any delay could mean the difference between a successful rescue and a complete mission failure. 3 American citizens would disappear into a network of safe houses and tunnels that would make finding them nearly impossible. "What are you thinking?" Johnson asked as he continued working on Captain Mitchell's wounds. Rodriguez looked at each of her teammates. Seeing the exhaustion and concern in their faces, they had just survived one of the most intense firefights any of them had experienced. Their commanding officer was critically wounded, and they were still facing a heavily defended position with an unknown number of enemy combatants. "I'm thinking someone needs to go in there and get those hostages before it's too late," Rodriguez said quietly. "And I'm thinking that someone is going to be me." The team exchanged glances, understanding immediately what Rodriguez was proposing. It wasn't just dangerous, it was borderline suicidal. A single soldier attempting to infiltrate a building held by a dozen or more insurgents went against every principle of military tactics they had been taught. William's voice came through their radio headsets from her overwatch position. "Rodriguez, I can see movement in the upper windows of the target building. It looks like they're preparing to move the hostages. We might have less time than we thought." The decision crystallized in Rodriguez's mind. She reached for Captain Mitchell's M4 rifle, checking its ammunition and condition. The weapon was slightly larger than her own rifle, but she was familiar with its operation and capabilities. More importantly, it had a grenade launcher attachment that might prove crucial in the close-quarters combat she was about to face. "You're not going alone," Chen said firmly. "If you're serious about this crazy plan, we're going with you." Rodriguez shook her head. "Someone needs to stay with the captain and coordinate with headquarters. And someone needs to maintain overwatch in case this goes wrong, and you need to call in that backup assault." The truth was that Rodriguez believed a single soldier might actually have a better chance than a larger group. She could move more quietly, present a smaller target, and potentially infiltrate the building without triggering the kind of massive firefight that would almost certainly result in the hostages being killed. Johnson finished stabilizing Captain Mitchell and looked up at Rodriguez. "His condition is stable for now, but he needs to get to a medical facility within the next few hours. If you're really going to try this, make it fast." Rodriguez secured Captain Mitchell's rifle across her back alongside her own weapon and checked her remaining equipment. She had enough ammunition for a sustained firefight, several grenades, her sidearm, and most importantly, the knowledge that her teammates would provide whatever support they could from their positions. As she prepared to leave the safety of their defensive perimeter, Rodriguez thought about all the training that had led to this moment. Countless hours on firing ranges, urban warfare exercises, hostage rescue simulations, and tactical planning sessions had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. But no amount of training could fully prepare someone for the reality of facing overwhelming odds with American lives hanging in the balance. The insurgents had settled into a defensive routine, apparently believing that the American rescue attempt had failed with the wounding of their commander. They had no way of knowing that Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was about to attempt something that would be studied in military academies for years to come. Rodriguez took a deep breath and began moving toward the compound, carrying 2 rifles and a determination that burned brighter than the desert sun. The compound's perimeter was a maze of concrete barriers, abandoned vehicles, and rocky outcroppings that had been turned into defensive positions by the insurgents. Rodriguez moved through this obstacle course like a ghost, using shadows and dead angles to avoid detection. Every step was calculated, every pause deliberate as she worked her way closer to the main building. She had studied the satellite imagery during their mission briefing, but seeing the compound up close revealed details that no aerial photograph could capture. The building was older than she had expected, with thick walls that showed bullet damage from previous conflicts. Several windows had been bricked up or covered with metal plates, leaving only narrow firing ports that would make accurate shooting difficult for the defenders but also limited their fields of view. Rodriguez identified what appeared to be a service entrance on the building's north side, partially concealed by an overhang that would provide cover from the upper windows. The door looked heavy and was probably locked, but it was her best option for gaining entry without alerting every insurgent in the compound. Moving carefully from cover to cover, Rodriguez made her way around the building's perimeter. The sounds of sporadic gunfire continued as her teammates maintained pressure on the main defensive positions, keeping the insurgents focused on external threats rather than watching for infiltrators. William's voice occasionally crackled through her earpiece, providing updates on enemy movements and clearing her path forward. "Rodriguez, I've got eyes on 2 guards patrolling the north side of the building," Williams reported quietly. "They're moving in a predictable pattern, checking the corners every few minutes. You'll have a window after they pass the service door." Rodriguez pressed herself against a concrete wall and waited. The patrol consisted of 2 men armed with AK-47s, moving casually in a way that suggested they weren't expecting any immediate threats from this direction. They spoke to each other in low voices as they walked, their weapons slung rather than at the ready. When the patrol moved past her position, Rodriguez counted to 30 before sprinting across the open ground to the service entrance. The door was indeed locked, but the lock was old and corroded. Using her combat knife and some techniques learned in specialized training, she managed to work the mechanism open without making enough noise to alert anyone inside. The door opened into a narrow hallway that smelled of dust, concrete, and something else Rodriguez couldn't immediately identify. Emergency lighting cast dim shadows along the walls, and she could hear voices echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. Rodriguez switched on her night vision equipment and began moving forward, both rifles ready for immediate use. The building's layout was more complex than the satellite images had suggested. Corridors branched in multiple directions, and Rodriguez could hear footsteps and voices coming from at least 3 different areas. She needed to locate the hostages quickly, but she also needed to avoid stumbling into insurgent positions that would turn her rescue mission into a suicide run. Rodriguez paused at a junction where 3 hallways met, listening carefully to the sounds echoing through the building. To her left, she could hear what sounded like multiple voices in animated discussion, probably a command post or planning session. Straight ahead, the hallway continued toward what appeared to be a larger room with more lighting. To her right, she heard something that made her heart race. A voice speaking English with an American accent. The English voice was weak and strained, but it was definitely American. Rodriguez moved carefully toward the sound, her weapons ready as she navigated through rooms filled with abandoned equipment and debris. The building had apparently been used for multiple purposes over the years, with evidence of military occupation, civilian habitation, and industrial activity scattered throughout. As she got closer to the source of the English voice, Rodriguez could make out more details. There were at least 2 American voices, both male, engaged in what sounded like a quiet conversation. She could also hear movement from guards who were apparently stationed nearby, their equipment rattling as they shifted positions. Rodriguez reached a corner where she could peer around and observe the situation. The Americans were being held in what had once been an office or meeting room. 3 men in civilian clothes sat on the floor, with their hands bound behind their backs, their faces showing the strain of captivity, but no signs of serious injury. 2 insurgent guards stood near the room's entrance, armed but not particularly alert. The tactical situation was challenging but manageable. Rodriguez needed to neutralize the guards quickly and quietly, then extract the hostages through a building that was filled with additional enemy combatants. Any noise or delay would bring reinforcements and turn the rescue into a running battle with odds heavily stacked against success. Rodriguez made her decision. She set down Captain Mitchell's M4 rifle and drew her sidearm, which would be more suitable for the close-quarters work she was about to undertake. The suppressor attached to the pistol would help minimize noise, though complete silence would be impossible given the building's acoustics. Moving with the careful precision of a surgeon, Rodriguez approached the first guard from behind. Her combat training included extensive work in silent takedowns, and she executed the technique flawlessly, using a chokehold that rendered the insurgent unconscious without giving him time to cry out. The second guard turned at the sound of his partner collapsing, but Rodriguez was already moving, her sidearm delivering 2 quick shots to the center of mass before he could raise his own weapon. The hostages looked up in amazement as Rodriguez entered their room, her face painted with camouflage and her equipment marking her as an American soldier. The relief in their eyes was immediately tempered by understanding of how dangerous their situation remained. "I'm Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, United States Army," she whispered as she moved to cut their bonds. "We're getting you out of here, but I need you to follow my instructions exactly. No talking, move when I move, stop when I stop." "Understood." The 3 contractors nodded eagerly. Rodriguez could see they were all in reasonably good physical condition despite their ordeal, which would be crucial for the extraction. She quickly assessed their clothing and equipment, noting that their civilian clothes would actually help them blend in with the building's shadows. "How many guards in the building?" Rodriguez asked the senior contractor, a man who appeared to be in his 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes. "We've counted at least 12, maybe more," he replied quietly. "They've got most of their people watching the approaches to the building, but there are usually 4 or 5 inside at any given time. They've been talking about moving us to another location, but we couldn't understand when." Rodriguez nodded and began planning their route out of the building. The service entrance she had used for entry would be their best exit option, but they would need to move carefully through several corridors that might be patrolled or watched. The contractors were not trained for combat movement, which would slow them down and potentially compromise their stealth. As she prepared to move out with the hostages, Rodriguez heard something that changed everything. Footsteps were approaching their location, and voices were getting louder. Someone had apparently discovered that the guards were missing, and additional insurgents were coming to investigate. Rodriguez positioned herself at the room's entrance, both weapons ready, as she prepared to defend the hostages. The tactical situation had just shifted from rescue to siege, and she was about to face odds that would challenge even the most experienced combat veteran. The first insurgent appeared in the doorway, expecting to find his missing comrades. Instead, he found Rodriguez's rifle pointed directly at his chest. The resulting firefight was brief but intense, with Rodriguez using her superior position and training to neutralize 3 attackers in quick succession. But the noise of gunfire echoed throughout the building, alerting everyone inside that the American rescue mission was underway. Rodriguez could hear running footsteps and shouted commands as insurgents throughout the building responded to the sound of combat. Their window for a quiet extraction had closed, and now they would have to fight their way out through a building full of armed enemies who knew exactly where they were. "Stay behind me and move when I tell you to move," Rodriguez told the hostages as she reloaded her weapons. "This is about to get very loud and very dangerous, but we're going home today." The senior contractor looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "How many of you are there?" he asked. Rodriguez checked her ammunition and equipment one final time before moving toward the hallway. "Right now, it's just me," she replied, "but that's going to be enough." As they prepared to leave the room, Rodriguez could hear her teammates outside the building, laying down covering fire and creating diversions to support her extraction. The sound of explosions and automatic weapons fire from multiple directions suggested that Chen had initiated a coordinated assault to draw attention away from her position inside the building. Rodriguez led the hostages into the hallway, moving in a tactical formation that provided maximum protection while maintaining mobility. The corridor ahead was partially lit by emergency lighting, creating a mixture of shadows and illuminated areas that would both help and hinder their movement. Insurgent voices echoed from multiple directions, and Rodriguez could tell they were trying to coordinate a response to trap her and the hostages inside the building. But she had advantages they didn't expect: superior training, better equipment, and most importantly, the element of surprise that came from doing something no reasonable tactical manual would recommend. As they moved through the building toward their extraction point, Rodriguez realized she was about to face the most challenging part of her mission. Getting into the building had been dangerous. Finding the hostages had been difficult. But getting all 4 of them out alive was going to require every skill and every ounce of determination she possessed. The sound of approaching footsteps told her that the real fight was just beginning. The hallway erupted in gunfire as insurgents converged on Rodriguez's position from 3 different directions. She pushed the hostages against the wall behind a concrete pillar and opened fire with both rifles, switching between them as ammunition ran low and targets presented themselves. The narrow corridor worked in her favor, creating a choke point that prevented the insurgents from using their numerical advantage effectively. Rodriguez's training took over completely as she engaged multiple targets in rapid succession. Each shot was precisely placed, each movement calculated to provide maximum protection for the hostages while maintaining offensive capability. The sound of gunfire in the enclosed space was deafening, and muzzle flashes lit up the corridor like a deadly strobe light. The first wave of insurgents fell back after losing 3 men to Rodriguez's accurate fire, but she knew they would regroup and return with a better plan. She used the brief lull to assess her ammunition situation and check on the hostages. All 3 contractors were unharmed, but clearly shaken by the intensity of the firefight. "We need to keep moving," Rodriguez told them. "They're going to try to flank us if we stay in one place too long." Leading the group forward, Rodriguez moved through the building using a combination of stealth and overwhelming firepower whenever they encountered resistance. Her knowledge of urban warfare tactics served her well as she anticipated insurgent movements and used the building's layout to her advantage. At the next intersection, Rodriguez deployed a fragmentation grenade around the corner before advancing, clearing the way of insurgents who had been setting up an ambush position. The explosion echoed through the building, adding to the chaos and confusion that was helping to mask their movements. Williams's voice crackled through Rodriguez's earpiece, providing updates from the Overwatch position. "Rodriguez, I'm seeing heavy movement around the building's main entrance. It looks like they're trying to seal off your primary exit route." Rodriguez had anticipated this possibility and already identified an alternative extraction point. A ground floor window on the building's east side would put them closer to her team's positions and provide better cover for the final sprint to safety. But reaching that window would require crossing the building's main corridor, which was almost certainly being watched or patrolled. As they approached the main corridor, Rodriguez could hear voices and movement from multiple directions. The insurgents were coordinating their search more effectively now, and she could tell they were beginning to understand the scope of what they were facing. The realization that a single American soldier had infiltrated their stronghold was probably causing panic among their leadership. Rodriguez positioned the hostages in a defensive alcove and prepared to cross the main corridor. The space was wider than the hallways they'd been using, with multiple entry points that would make it difficult to control. But it was also the fastest route to their extraction point, and speed was becoming more important than stealth. "When I start moving, follow me immediately," Rodriguez instructed the contractors. "Don't hesitate, don't look back, just run where I run, and get down when I tell you to get down." Rodriguez burst into the main corridor, with both rifles firing, engaging targets at both ends of the hallway, simultaneously. Her ability to effectively use 2 weapons at once was the result of specialized training that few soldiers received, and it allowed her to dominate a much larger space than would normally be possible for a single combatant. The hostages followed her across the corridor, their movement awkward, but determined as they struggled to keep up with Rodriguez's combat pace. Bullets cracked past their heads and chewed chunks of concrete from the walls, but Rodriguez's suppressive fire kept the insurgents pinned down long enough for the group to reach the relative safety of another hallway. As they moved toward the extraction window, Rodriguez began to notice something troubling about the insurgents' tactics. Their initial response had been chaotic and poorly coordinated, but their movements were becoming more organized and professional. Someone with military training was apparently taking control of their response, which would make the final phase of the extraction significantly more dangerous. The window Rodriguez had identified as their extraction point was located in what had once been a storage room filled with abandoned equipment and supplies. As they approached the room, Rodriguez could see that her assessment had been correct. The window would provide access to the building's exterior, with good cover from her teammates' positions, but the insurgents had apparently reached the same conclusion. As Rodriguez entered the storage room, she found herself facing 4 armed men who had positioned themselves to ambush anyone trying to use the window for escape. The tactical situation had suddenly become much more complex and dangerous. Rodriguez immediately pushed the hostages behind a large metal cabinet and engaged the insurgents in the closest quarters combat she had experienced since entering the building. At distances of less than 10 feet, there was no room for tactical maneuvering or complex planning. Everything came down to speed, accuracy, and the kind of combat instincts that could only be developed through years of training and experience. The firefight was brief but incredibly intense. Rodriguez used both rifles and her sidearm, switching between weapons as the tactical situation demanded. She also employed hand-to-hand combat techniques when one insurgent managed to close to within arm's reach, using her combat knife to neutralize the threat before he could bring his weapon to bear. When the shooting stopped, all 4 insurgents were down, but Rodriguez had taken a hit in her left shoulder. The wound was painful but not immediately life-threatening, though it would affect her ability to handle both rifles with full effectiveness. She quickly applied a field dressing to control the bleeding and assessed her remaining capabilities. "Are you okay?" asked the senior contractor, who had witnessed the entire firefight from behind their cover position. "I'll live," Rodriguez replied, though she could feel her strength beginning to fade from blood loss and exhaustion. "But we need to get out of here right now. More of them will be coming." Rodriguez moved to the window and looked out at the terrain they would need to cross to reach her team's positions. The distance was approximately 100 meters across open ground that was partially covered by rocks and debris, but still exposed to fire from multiple directions. Her teammates were laying down, covering fire, but the insurgents had established several defensive positions that would make the crossing extremely dangerous. As Rodriguez prepared to break out the window, she heard something that made her heart sink. Heavy footsteps and multiple voices were approaching the storage room from the direction they had come. The insurgents had tracked them to their location and were preparing for a final assault that would trap them in the room with no escape route. Rodriguez looked at the hostages, seeing the fear in their eyes, but also a determination that reminded her why she had chosen to attempt this rescue in the first place. These were Americans, citizens who had been serving their country in their own way when they were captured. Getting them home safely was worth any risk she might have to take. "Get ready to run," Rodriguez told them as she prepared both rifles for the firefight that was about to begin. "When I break this window, you're going to go through it and run straight toward those rocks out there. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't worry about me. My team will cover you." Rodriguez positioned herself at the room's entrance, both weapons trained on the doorway where the insurgents would appear. She could hear them coordinating their assault, preparing to rush the room with overwhelming numbers. But Rodriguez had one advantage they didn't expect. She was willing to do whatever it took to complete her mission, regardless of the personal cost. The first insurgents appeared in the doorway, and Rodriguez opened fire with everything she had. The narrow entrance became a killing field as she poured accurate fire into anyone who tried to enter the room. Her wounded shoulder made handling both rifles difficult, but adrenaline and determination kept her fighting at full effectiveness. Behind her, she could hear the hostages breaking out the window and preparing to make their run for freedom. The sound of their escape gave Rodriguez the strength she needed to continue holding off the insurgent assault. She had come too far and sacrificed too much to fail now. As her ammunition ran low and more insurgents gathered outside the room, Rodriguez made a decision that would define the final phase of their escape. She pulled her last fragmentation grenade from her belt and prepared to use it in a way that would either save them all or end her own life in the process. The battle for the storage room was about to reach its climax, and Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez was prepared to pay any price necessary to ensure that 3 American hostages made it home alive. Rodriguez held the fragmentation grenade in her wounded left hand while maintaining fire with her rifle, waiting for the perfect moment to use her final weapon. The insurgents were massing outside the storage room, apparently preparing for a coordinated rush that would overwhelm her defensive position through sheer numbers. "Go! Go! Go!" Rodriguez shouted to the hostages as they climbed through the broken window. She could see them dropping to the ground outside and beginning their sprint toward her team's positions. William's rifle cracked from the overwatch position, taking down insurgents who were trying to intercept the escaping contractors. The moment the last hostage cleared the window, Rodriguez made her move. She pulled the pin on the fragmentation grenade and released the spoon, counting down the seconds as insurgents began pouring through the doorway. Instead of throwing the grenade at them, she held onto it, using it as leverage to force them back, while she made her own escape through the window. The psychological effect was immediate and dramatic. The insurgents, seeing an armed American soldier holding a live grenade in an enclosed space, scrambled backward in panic. Rodriguez used those crucial seconds to dive through the window herself, rolling as she hit the ground outside and hurling the grenade back through the window behind her. The explosion shattered what remained of the storage room's windows and sent debris flying in all directions. Rodriguez was already running across the open ground toward her team's positions, her wounded shoulder screaming with pain, but her legs carrying her forward through pure determination.
Insurgent fire erupted from multiple positions around the compound as she sprinted across the killing ground.
Bullets cracked past her head and kicked up dust around her feet, but her teammates' covering fire was keeping the most dangerous shooters suppressed. Martinez's heavy machine gun was laying down a steady stream of suppressive fire that forced the insurgents to keep their heads down. Rodriguez could see the hostages ahead of her, running with the awkward gait of civilians under fire, but making steady progress towards safety. Chen had moved forward from the team's defensive positions and was providing close cover for the contractors, his rifle engaging any threats that appeared too close to their route. The final 50 meters felt like the longest distance Rodriguez had ever covered. Her strength was fading rapidly from blood loss and exhaustion, her breathing was labored, and her vision was beginning to blur around the edges. But she could see safety ahead, could see her teammates and the hostages reaching the cover of their defensive perimeter. Williams's voice came through her earpiece, urgent but controlled. "Rodriguez, you've got a shooter in the upper window of the main building, 11 o'clock. He's got a clear shot at your position." Rodriguez looked up and saw the muzzle flash as the insurgent fired. The bullet passed so close to her head that she felt the displacement of air, but she was already diving toward a concrete barrier that would provide cover. Behind her, she could hear more insurgents emerging from the damaged building, their voices raised in anger and frustration at her successful rescue. From her position behind the barrier, Rodriguez could see that all 3 hostages had reached safety and were being treated by Johnson. The mission's primary objective had been accomplished, the American contractors were free, and would soon be on their way home to their families. But Rodriguez's own situation was becoming more precarious by the moment. She was cut off from her team by 50 meters of open ground that was now swept by fire from multiple insurgent positions. Her ammunition was running low, her shoulder wound was affecting her ability to return accurate fire, and she could feel her strength continuing to drain away. Chen's voice crackled through her radio. "Rodriguez, we're going to lay down covering fire and come get you. Hold your position and get ready to move on my signal." Rodriguez looked back toward the building she had just escaped and saw insurgents taking positions to cut off any rescue attempt. The tactical situation was clear. Any attempt by her teammates to reach her position would likely result in casualties and might compromise the successful extraction of the hostages. "Negative," Rodriguez replied. "You need to get those hostages back to base for medical attention. I can hold this position until backup arrives." The truth was that Rodriguez wasn't sure she could hold the position for much longer, but she wasn't going to risk her teammates' lives or the mission's success for her own safety. The contractors were the priority, and getting them to safety was more important than any individual soldier's survival. But her teammates had other ideas. While she had been focused on the threats from the building, Chen had been coordinating with Williams and Martinez to execute a rescue plan that would extract Rodriguez without compromising the hostages' safety. The plan went into motion with the precision of a well-rehearsed drill. Martinez's heavy machine gun opened up with sustained fire that forced every insurgent in the compound to seek cover. Williams began taking precise shots at specific targets, neutralizing the most dangerous threats to any rescue attempt. Chen launched smoke grenades to create a screen between Rodriguez's position and the main insurgent positions. Under cover of this coordinated suppression, Johnson and Thompson moved forward in a flanking maneuver that brought them to within 20 meters of Rodriguez's position. The 2 soldiers had left the hostages in the care of the base security team that had arrived as backup and were now focused entirely on extracting their teammate. "Rodriguez, we're coming to get you," Thompson called over the radio. "When you see our smoke, start moving toward our position." Rodriguez looked up to see colored smoke beginning to billow between her position and her teammates. The covering fire from Martinez and Williams was so intense that the insurgents couldn't maintain effective fire on the area she would need to cross. This was her chance, and probably her only chance. Gathering the last of her strength, Rodriguez sprinted from behind the concrete barrier toward the colored smoke that marked her teammate's position. Her legs felt like lead, and her vision was tunneling, but she could see Johnson and Thompson advancing to meet her halfway. The final moments of the extraction played out like a scene from a movie. Rodriguez stumbled and nearly fell just as she reached her teammates, who caught her and helped her cover the remaining distance to safety. Behind them, the insurgents' fire intensified in a final, desperate attempt to inflict casualties. But the Americans had already moved beyond effective range. As they reached the safety of their defensive perimeter, Rodriguez finally allowed herself to collapse. Johnson immediately began treating her wounds while Thompson coordinated with headquarters for immediate medical evacuation. The 3 rescued contractors looked on with expressions of amazement and gratitude as they realized what Rodriguez had sacrificed to secure their freedom. Captain Mitchell, conscious now despite his injuries, was helped over to where Rodriguez lay receiving medical treatment. His face showed a mixture of pride, concern, and professional admiration as he looked down at his subordinate. "Rodriguez," he said quietly, What you did in there, that's going to be talked about for a long time. You saved those men's lives and completed a mission that most people would have considered impossible. Rodriguez managed a weak smile despite her exhaustion and pain. Just doing my job, sir. Leave no one behind, complete the mission. That's what we trained for. The extraction helicopters arrived 30 minutes later, landing in a whirlwind of dust and rotor noise that signaled the end of one of the most remarkable rescue operations in recent military history. As Rodriguez was loaded onto a medical stretcher, she could see the 3 contractors being helped aboard another helicopter, alive and free, thanks to the actions of her entire team. During the flight back to base, Rodriguez drifted in and out of consciousness, her mind replaying the events of the past few hours. She thought about the decision to drag Captain Mitchell through enemy fire, the choice to infiltrate the building alone, and the determination that had carried her through the most intense combat of her military career. The medical teams at the base hospital worked quickly to stabilize both Rodriguez and Captain Mitchell. Rodriguez's shoulder wound required surgery, but the doctors assured her that she would make a full recovery and return to active duty within a few months. Captain Mitchell's injuries were more serious, but he too would survive and eventually return to command. In the days that followed, Rodriguez found herself visited by senior officers who wanted to understand exactly how she had managed to accomplish what tactical doctrine suggested was impossible. Her detailed debriefing sessions would eventually contribute to new training protocols and tactical procedures that would benefit future military operations. The 3 rescued contractors made a point of visiting Rodriguez in the hospital before their departure back to the United States. They expressed gratitude that went beyond words, understanding that they owed their lives to her courage and determination. The senior contractor pressed a business card into her hand and told her that if she ever needed anything after her military service, she should not hesitate to contact him. Rodriguez kept that business card, though she never expected to use it. Her commitment was to the military and to the soldiers who served alongside her. The rescue mission had reinforced her belief that the bonds between soldiers were stronger than any individual concern for personal safety. Captain Mitchell made a full recovery and was promoted to major within 6 months of the operation. He made sure that Rodriguez received full recognition for her actions, recommending her for the Distinguished Service Cross and ensuring that her story became part of the unit's official history. Rodriguez herself was promoted to Sergeant First Class and given the opportunity to attend advanced leadership training that would prepare her for greater responsibilities. But she never forgot the lessons learned during those crucial 47 minutes when everything depended on split-second decisions and the willingness to risk everything for her fellow Americans. Years later, when Rodriguez had become a senior non-commissioned officer responsible for training the next generation of soldiers, she would often tell the story of that mission. Not to glorify combat or promote reckless heroism, but to illustrate the importance of training, teamwork, and the fundamental military principle that no mission is more important than the soldiers who execute it. The compound was eventually destroyed in follow-up operations, and intelligence gathered from the site helped prevent numerous other attacks against American forces. The 3 contractors returned to their families and eventually to their work, though they carried with them a profound appreciation for the sacrifices made by the men and women in uniform. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez returned to duty with a Purple Heart, a Distinguished Service Cross, and the knowledge that when faced with an impossible choice, she had chosen to risk everything for her fellow Americans. It was, she often reflected, exactly what any soldier would have done in the same situation. But those who served with her knew better. What Rodriguez accomplished that day went beyond ordinary military service into the realm of extraordinary courage that defines the very best of the American military tradition. Her story became proof that sometimes, when everything seems lost and the odds appear insurmountable, the determination of a single soldier can change the outcome of an entire mission. A letter Rodriguez had written to her sister before the mission was never sent. Instead, it was replaced by a phone call home, a conversation filled with relief and gratitude that she had survived to continue serving the country and the soldiers she had sworn to protect.